everyone, and welcome back to this online lecture series. We're going to continue talking about language and literacy development in children. And in an earlier lecture, you may recall that I talked to you about a small study that we did comparing outcomes in children with hearing aids and children with cochlear implants. So children who have more sort of severe type hearing losses and children with profound hearing losses. I'm going to continue talking about that a little bit more in depth. More specifically, to look a little more closely, I'll just remind you of the overall results, but more important, I want to look a little more closely with you at some of the relationships between speech recognition, spoken language, and literacy. How does it all kind of fit together, or does it fit together, and what have we learned? So let's take a look at that together, shall we? We know that research with children with cochlear implants is focused largely on speech perception and to a lesser degree some speech production. More recently, we're getting more in terms of language development and literacy development, but overall, a lot of the studies, perhaps because they were carried out by audiologists and otolaryngologists and cochlear implant teams, were particularly interested in, does this cochlear implant make a difference in terms of hearing? And so probably the best proxy that we had in terms of looking at hearing and how people perform with a device like a cochlear implant was to look at speech recognition. So we did a lot of that, and certainly we found out very early on in terms of cochlear implantation, and perhaps even somewhat to our amazement, how well cochlear implants and so on actually work in terms of producing better speech recognition scores, more accurate production of phonemes, greater phonological awareness. So that's all been really good, and of course, this led to children with even sort of less profound degrees of hearing loss becoming candidates for a cochlear implant. But let's try and look a little bit at how well does that all kind of relate to, what's the relationship with literacy? How does that kind of fit together? As Spencer Markshark pointed out, the evidence-based establishing successful intervention approaches continue to be severely limited. We don't always know what's the best intervention approach, what's the best intervention for a specific child in terms of developing language and in terms of developing literacy. So I think it's really worth us taking sort of a closer look at what some of these outcomes look like to see what we can glean from them. All right, so let me share the study findings. Just to remind you, so this was the study that I talked about in an earlier presentation where we wanted to look at sort of decision-making practices, and we did a national study of the Canadian centers. We've talked about that part, so I'll leave that for now. It's just to kind of contextualize this a little bit for you. And we also evaluated outcomes in multiple domains in speech recognition, language, and literacy in children with hearing loss who used either hearing aids because of a severe hearing loss or cochlear implants because of a severe to profound hearing loss. And these were groups of kids who came from the same birth cohort. So again, just a reminder, because you've already seen this if you took the previous lecture, is that these were children, we had 20 children in our hearing aid group, 21 in our cochlear implant group, average age of about 12 in the hearing aid group, 10 in the cochlear implant group, pure tone average of about 70 decibels in our hearing aid group, and our kids with cochlear implants an average of 100 decibels. We did assessment measures in multiple domains, looking at speech recognition, vocabulary, receptive language, expressive language, speech production, literacy, and we had some cognitive measures as well to ensure that we were comparing kids who were at approximately the same cognitive levels. So here are the cognitive measures. Just to remind you, so if we look at the full group together, in verbal comprehension, they came out, so the mean for typically developing children on this test is 100 with a standard deviation of 15. And these children came out in verbal comprehension to just sort of borderline normal, about an 84, 85, 84.3, so just outside the sort of normal range. Perceptual reasoning, they did very well. Nonverbal, they did very well, 106. Working memory, again, sort of borderline. And processing speed, we were at a 95 standard score. So that sort of just gives you the context. These were kids who were typically developing overall in other domains other than had hearing loss. Just to summarize the scores, the overall scores in terms of vocabulary and language, etc. In vocabulary, using the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which I'm sure you're familiar with, standard score of 85. Core language, using the SELF test, the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals, they were a little bit below what we'd hoped for, a little bit outside that 85. Similarly, in terms of phonological awareness and phonological memory, we found their scores were a bit lower than we would expect for typically developing children for the average levels. Did better in rapid naming, and in speech recognition, we had about a 70% understanding of monosyllabic words, so of single words like bead, shoe, house, those kinds of things. So that kind of just gives you the big picture of what those children look like. So that was an overview of the speech language and speech recognition results. Now in terms of the literacy results, if you look at the slide, you'll see that overall those results were quite encouraging. We did assessments we did subtests in word reading, in pseudo word reading, so that would be sort of made up words. So a pseudo word would be a word like bait, B-A-T-E, for example, bane. Those would be the kinds of words that the child would be presented with and asked to read them. Did very well, 98, and again the standard score, just to remind you, for these tests is 100. Spelling recognition from the Peabody Individual Achievement Test, a score of 103. A little bit weaker in reading comprehension, and so it's kind of hard to know what's going on there. These kids can word read, they can pseudo word read, doing well in spelling, but overall more of a weakness in terms of reading comprehension. That just seems to be tougher for our children. So that was silent reading of a passage and then answering questions. Again, as I mentioned in a previous talk, much less difficult in terms of the sort of kind of explicit information, when the information is present in the text, and the subtest, and very concrete for them, they can handle it and respond to the questions. But once things get a little more advanced and more implicit, more inferential kind of information, they certainly have more difficulty with that. So let's take a look at some of the individual results, because one of the problems with small studies, but what I find in our field, is because there's so much variability in how these children perform, is that it's useful to look at an average and say, gee, on average these kids are functioning close to the normal hearing peers, because that's certainly what we see in the literacy, with the exception of reading comprehension. We were very pleased to see how these kids, school age level kids, were doing. But it's really worthwhile taking a look at sort of the individual scores, especially in small sample sizes. So here are our phonetically balanced kindergarten results. So again, just to remind you, this is a commonly used test in audiology, which we administer in the Sound Suite using recorded. In our case, we used all recorded materials. A normal hearing child at school age would normally get 90, 95, 100%. I mean, they can just hear these single syllable words. Our kids with hearing loss, what we showed was around about a 70% average. We're just counting the number of words correct or the number of phonemes correct, a 70% average. When we look at them across the board, though, we saw that some of these kids, if you look at the green graph on your left, those would be our children who used hearing aids, or our severely hearing impaired children with an average of about a 70 dB hearing loss, and then our profoundly hearing impaired children who used cochlear implants. And you see the results look very similar overall, and we had them, they were pretty much matched in terms of their overall scores. But you kind of see that when you look at the profile, it's very telling when you look at the profile of the individual kiddies. So we had a couple of kids, if you look sort of to the right of each graph, we had a few kids getting up to close to that 90 to 100% range, so really functioning in terms of speech recognition like any other child in their class should. But if you look to the left of the screen, you see that some of these kids are really struggling, and that's where, in terms of looking at these kids who have some residual hearing with the severe hearing loss, so the kids in the graph with the green bars, it's really worthwhile going and looking at, can we make things better for those kids, for example, who are down there at that 30, 40% range? Can we improve things with a cochlear implant? Then if we look at receptive vocabulary, again, a similar picture. Overall, our kids with hearing aids function better. They had a standard score of 92 compared to a standard score of 100 for the test norm. Our kids with cochlear implants were lower. They were significantly lower at a mean of 77. And you can see that we had a number of children in the cochlear implant group who were well below that 100 line. We had about half the children who were below sort of that magic average for the test. So that was worrisome. Again, I just want to remind you from this study, these were kiddies who were in the school system. Some of them had received cochlear implants early, some of them had received cochlear implants later. All kinds of other factors going to affect the results, and they may not necessarily be reflective, and they won't be reflective of these children who are all receiving their cochlear implants at a year or a year and a half of age. So there's a whole mixed range. We live in an area where we have a number of families who move in from other countries, and so we certainly get a whole very heterogeneous group. The children on the left, in terms of their receptive vocabulary, we're seeing almost half the kiddies under that. They did better, and on average they certainly did better, but we still see about half the children not performing at the average for the tests. If we look at the SELF, Clinical Evaluation of Language Functions, we look at the core language score, which is a combination of several subtests. The kids with hearing aids came out looking much better here than the kids with cochlear implants. So again, if you look at the children with cochlear implants, we had a good 50% of them or so performing below what we'd hope for in terms of the average for the test, in terms of the test norm. Phonological awareness, overall these children were doing pretty well, but again we see that variability, particularly in the children with cochlear implants, interestingly enough. We saw much more variability. If you look to the right of your screen, there's much more variability in the children who use cochlear implants in terms of their phonological awareness abilities as measured by the CTOP test. If we look at rapid naming, so that's labeling things quickly, we saw the results were pretty similar for both groups, coming in around 90 to 95 standard score. So overall, these two groups, we didn't see the variability in this one that we saw, for example, if we just go back to the previous slide in phonological awareness and in some of the language tests. Now, if you look at word reading, again, we're seeing a very consistent pattern in our children with hearing aids and in our children with cochlear implants. The overall mean, interestingly enough, the overall mean, if we look at the mean for the children with hearing aids, the severely hearing impaired group, and the children with cochlear implants, they're very similar. One is at a standard score of 96 and the other at a standard score of 98. But we have many more children in the cochlear implant group performing at a lower level than the children with hearing aids. Okay, so we wanted to take a look also at some of the relationships. I mean, ideally, in an ideal world, you would think, well, the better someone hears, the better these children are hearing, the better they're likely to perform in some of these language tests, because that's what we work so hard. We work so hard to get every scrap of hearing, every decibel, to help these children hear, to be able to process language and ultimately develop their literacy skills. And Blamey did a study back in, I think it was 2001, when he looked at children. I believe there were something like 88 children or so in the full study, and I don't know if it was 40 with hearing aids and 48 with 44 with cochlear implants, or 44 and 40, but around 40 in each group, and found a strong relationship between phonetically between monosyllabic words and sentences with the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, for example, and some of the other test measures. So found that strong relationship. So we thought we'd go in and take a look at that in terms of some of our tests. We looked at PBK words, so speech recognition scores, which on average were at about 70%. They're recognizing 70% of the words. We looked at those in the context of the self-core language score. And we did find, if you look at the p-value, peak was 0.006, we did find a significant relationship between those two. So the better were the speech recognition scores, the better were the language scores for these children. Higher speech recognition equals higher language. What we'd expect, very nice. It all fit together beautifully. Now, when we look at some of the other scores, we look at the Peabody, for example, so receptive vocabulary on your left compared with the gray silent reading score. So receptive vocabulary, we know that receptive vocabulary, the Peabody, is a highly predictive measure of all kinds of things in language and literacy, which is one of the reasons we like it and use it so much. Look at the Peabody with the gray silent reading test, and we see, and so that's the graph on the left, we see a significant relationship as well. The better the kids did on receptive vocabulary, the better were their scores in reading comprehension. Again, it's what we'd expect. No surprises there. If you have a really good, solid, strong vocabulary base, it's going to help increase your chances to comprehend texts because you're going to understand the vocabulary and you're going to understand the meaning of the words. Similarly, in terms of word reading, so the Wyatt word reading subtest is we show the child a list of words and they have to simply just read the words. And again, we saw a strong relationship, a good relationship between their receptive vocabulary score and their word reading abilities. So far, things fit together. We've got speech recognition linking up nicely with language. We've got receptive vocabulary linking up with reading comprehension, and receptive vocabulary well connected to word reading scores. Let's take a look at some of the others. So here's the PBK with phonological, some of the phonological processing. If you look on, I'm going to direct you to the right here first. So if you look at the CTOP rapid naming, we didn't find any relationship here. So the straight lines, basically we'd see the line, we'd like to see the line like the straight lines. We're seeing no relationship, nothing substantive between PBK words, so how well you perceive speech as measured by your responses to recorded words, and rapid naming is measured by the CTOP test. When we looked at the self-language score with the gray silent reading, the graph on the left, we do see a relationship. So better language equals better reading comprehension. We also saw a relationship between core language score on the self and the Wyatt word reading. So again, better is your language, better is likely to be your ability to read words. So nicely connected, and in that graph on the right, we had a very nice relationship, as you can tell by the lines there, both for the children with hearing aids and for the children with cochlear implants. Now, when we look at the CTOP with word reading, so we look at the CTOP rapid naming in this case, along with the Wyatt word reading, again, we see a relationship. Those children who were able to do the rapid naming exercise well were able to better read words and got higher scores on word reading. When we look at the spelling and the digit span forward from the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Test, so repeating digits, 3, 5, 7, 9, 8, that kind of thing, we did find a relationship as well. So overall, these things are connected. These things look good, but it is complicated. We didn't see I showed some of the relationships. We didn't see some of the relationships that we thought we might see in some of those. And I think partly it's because our groups of children are so heterogeneous, they're so different, there's so many other factors. So in a perfect world, all of these things should line up pretty nicely. You hear better, you read better. But we had some children who didn't do so well in their speech recognition abilities, who did very well in their reading. We've also got kids in sort of mixed interventions, crossing over from one to the other, and that can change things. And so this is really not about cause and effect. It's not real clear what's causing what's had that positive effect on reading, but rather what we're seeing here are associations between some of the speech recognition skills, the language, and the literacy. Here's some suggested readings for you. And again, I want to thank you very much for participating in this online seminar. And I hope this information about some of the relationships that we're seeing and perhaps not seeing, and particularly, I think the message I want to leave you with is that there's incredible individual variability in these outcomes for our children. And so we really need to be on top of things and looking at, again, that whole package of information so that we can sort of better target what these kids need work on. We can't assume that because one is high on speech recognition, one is going to necessarily be scoring well in terms of language and literacy, and vice versa, although certainly lots of relationships between all of them. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.